as Brian mentioned, and as I'm sure I've talked with many of you about in the past, the story started for us in 2010 when we lost my mom to what we later learned, not during her disease but after her death, was genetic Prion disease. It was caused by the FFI mutation. And this information was put into our hands not long after losing her and watching, as so many of you have, what these diseases do to people firsthand. And then, as we're these two fine individuals, we were given the choice. Would you want to know if you carried this mutation? So this is different for everyone. For us, the answer came instantaneously, which was we wanted to know what we were up against. So we, set about sending in that blood sample, waiting for our results. And this is something else that's different for everyone, but what I've found for me in retrospect is that the time in which I knew myself to be at risk but didn't know the answer, that was the most acute torture. I was flipping the coin in my mind constantly, and to focus on my job, to focus on anything else was almost impossible for me. And then the results came back, and they certainly weren't what we'd hoped. So I was positive for the mutation. But knowing that allowed us to sort of, begin the painful but ultimately productive, I think, process of coming to terms with it, grappling with it, and figuring out what does this mean for us. And what it meant for us ended up being kind of surprising to us. So at this time, I was a recent law school graduate, and Erik was trained in city planning and engineering, and we thought we sort of had our professional futures figured out. And what ended up happening is that we became really, compelled to learn as much as we could about these diseases, and that sort of took on a life of its own.
Sure. And I think this really surprised us. If you had asked me several years ago, before I knew that there was anything in Sonia's family, what would you do if you or someone you love had a fatal genetic mutation? I would say I have no idea. Probably just cry a lot. But it was only after we got the test results that suddenly we found ourselves doing things we had never imagined. So we quit our old jobs, left our old careers. We started taking night classes in biology. We started coming to conferences such as this one. We eventually got jobs in research labs at Massachusetts General Hospital. Originally not working on Prion disease. We were just kind of, working in science labs, trying to build up that skill set, learn how to read papers, learn how to do some techniques. After a couple of years of that, we applied to graduate school to do a PhD in biological and biomedical sciences at Harvard. We started that in fall 2014. About a year later, so a year into our PhD, we joined a lab. So we're in Stuart Schreiber's lab at the Broad Institute. The Broad Institute is a joint research institute of Harvard and MIT focused on genomics and drug discovery. And they have amazing platforms for all the things that we want to do. And so we were in the incredibly lucky position of being able to come in and basically say, we have our problem that we want to solve, and we want to use your tools and your expertise to do it. And they've been really generous about making a space for us, literally giving us a Prion room, renovating it for us, and giving us all the mentorship and support that we could want to pursue our dream. So we're basically in the luckiest imaginable position of, every day we wake up and we go to work trying to cure Sonia's disease and all of your disease.
That's right. So I just wanted to say a few words about how going public has impacted our lives. And so have these guys, right? Like, very much out there with this genetic information. And it wasn't clear to us in the very beginning that that was a wise thing to do. We were terrified. When we were first setting out to get tested, our topmost question was, how can we do this in complete secrecy? The answer turns out to be you can't, et cetera, and we came to terms with that slowly. And now, several years later, if you Google my name, you don't have to click on a link to see that I have this mutation in my genome. It's right there. We took a gamble. I feel like we sort of put ourselves out there as guinea pigs, and this is just one person's experience. I can't speak to every situation, but what I can say for us is that it has only been a positive. And I look back on all that fear that I had and think, wow, how surprised am I that this information has only opened doors for us professionally. It has only brought us support personally, and it has only helped us, actually, shockingly, in matters such as insurance. To my amazement, like my insurance company, has stepped up to fund things such as getting baseline studies done that are expensive and that ordinarily wouldn't be done for someone my age, and for helping us think through our reproductive options. So that, to me, was a major and pleasant surprise. As people who are both patients and scientists, I think we have sort of like an unusual, kind of like a strange perspective on things. One thing I wanted to just mention is I get the question a lot, what do you do day to day to prevent the onset of prion disease for yourself? And my answer is, I eat pretty well and I exercise, but that is actually stuff I did before I received this diagnosis. That's just a sort of general upkeep of health philosophy. There's nothing that I do day to day in terms of taking any sort of drug or supplement. It's my personal belief on the weight of the evidence that we don't have anything right now that's going to delay disease in me. But that is not to say that we're pessimists, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then one other thing that I think is unusual about our perspective is that I have participated quite a bit in research and, poked and prodded in needles and whatever. And we've also been on the requesting end as researchers, trying to access these samples and seeing firsthand just how few they are in number and just how instrumental they are to getting some of the most important work done in the field. So I just want to give a shout out to everybody who has participated in research in any form, whether that's a blood or CSF draw, whether that's answering survey questions or taking cognitive tests, or in whatever capacity you folks have put yourself out there to contribute. That is the fuel on which research moves, and we are beyond grateful.
So I also want to say a bit about the ways in which we're optimistic. And I think one of the surprises for us over the last 5 years has been that as we've learned more science, we've become both more skeptical and more optimistic. More skeptical in the sense that we don't believe most of what we read in the scientific literature, but more optimistic in the sense that we think in the long term there's a lot of hope for developing a treatment for these diseases. And you might ask, well, how can those two things possibly go together? And I think one of the key observations, and Joel made this point pretty elegantly the other day, is that we have a clear target in our disease. So I want to draw a distinction between common complex diseases like heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, things where there's multiple genetic risk factors, multiple proteins involved, multiple pathological processes, and you don't know for sure if you target one of those, will that really change the outcome? Prion disease is simple in a way, and we're lucky for that. This disease is caused by a protein called PRP. That protein changes shape to cause the disease. The only genetic risk factors for prion disease are changes in the gene that encodes PRP. The only environmental risk factor for prion disease is exposure to infectious prions made of PRP. This protein is the disease. And so when we talk about hypotheses like Byron talked about, reducing, Byron and Roberto Chiesa as well, reducing the level of PRP that your brain produces, or trying to stabilize PRP, lock it in its healthy state so that it can't misfold. These are very strong therapeutic hypotheses. And I think that gives us a huge advantage over diseases that are much more common but also much more complicated. So I think there's a lot of hope in that. And I think we have a good roadmap towards therapeutics going forward.
Yeah, so I think we draw a lot of strength and optimism day to day from that roadmap. And how lucky are we to have it? A lot of diseases don't have that. The flip side of that is that I could never have imagined before we got into this line of work just how difficult it is. And our view as humans of our own biology, it's like you're peering under the front door of a huge house, trying to understand everything that's going on inside. Like, our view of what goes on in our bodies is so limited. At the same time, we're able to treat a lot of diseases. And you don't need to build every brick in the wall of your understanding of a biological phenomenon in order to be able to change it in a reproducible way. And so we really believe that the tools are in place to make logical attempts to treat prion disease, and these things are happening. It's so exciting. We couldn't ask to be doing this at a better moment in history. We're truly so lucky to be able to do this work and try to contribute. It's going to be slow work. It's going to be a lot of work. To the extent that we are all brought here by suffering and by having lived through an incredibly difficult experience, I know firsthand that can really, there's a temptation to be angry at some of the moving parts in the system that seem to be in the way of therapeutics. There's a temptation to be angry at physicians or at researchers or at regulators or at any of the sort of players in this complex system that we have for bringing drugs to patients. But if there's one thing I can say as a person who's a little bit of a bridge between two of these worlds, it's please try to open your hearts as much as you can to the ways in which we need all of these people and the ways in which it really is a miracle that they come together time and time again to produce drugs that treat disease. And, we have drugs on the shelf today, and I hope that soon, someday, we'll have one for our disease too. So, thanks very much.